The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on intelligent metadata and how it drives early attrition in drug development. We are doing this broadcast in listen-only mode. If you have questions, please enter them in the question box on your GoToWebinar console. We will take questions at the end of the broadcast and we'll endeavor to answer as many as we possibly can. My name is Ann Lapkin. I manage strategy and marketing for SmartLogic, and with me today is Lior Keat, who is the practice lead for the Life Sciences R&D division of HighPoint Solutions. SmartLogic was founded in 2007 and we have over 130 customers, mostly Global 2000 organizations who use the SmartLogic semantic platform. Our company has global reach. We have customers in the United States, in the Pacific Rim, in the Middle East, and in Europe and Asia. We have a very extensive partner network. HighPoint is one of our most valued partners in the life sciences and healthcare space. We have offices in the US and in the United Kingdom. And Lior, could you tell us a little bit about HighPoint?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lior Keat. As Ann mentioned, I'm responsible for the growth and development of our life sciences R&D practice at HighPoint Solutions. Founded in 1999, HighPoint Solutions is a globally operated solution-oriented consulting firm that is dedicated to serving both the life sciences and healthcare industries. We deliver business value and competitive advantage to more than 140 clients globally. Specifically, HighPoint's life sciences R&D practice is dedicated to helping our clients control the volume, velocity, and variety of data across the R&D lifecycle. We guide and mentor our clients through the assessment, pilot, acquisition, governance, and analysis of the entire R&D data lifecycle. Our efforts enable R&D organizations to deploy solutions that support evolving regulatory compliance and business strategies within R&D.
All right, thank you. And so here's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the business problem. Not that you guys don't know what the business problem is, but we're going to illuminate a little bit about the business problem from the perspective of some of the root causes and some of the data issues. Then we're going to talk about unified intelligent information, what that is and why we think it's important. We're going to talk about metadata and what a difficult problem that is, and how unified intelligent information supports a healthy pipeline. And then, because you can never do any of this with technology alone, we're going to talk a little bit about the things that you need to think about beyond technology, and then finish up by talking about the steps that you need to take to get to business value in developing an optimized pipeline, and what the first step would be in a little bit more detail, which is a stakeholder alignment workshop. We're going to talk just briefly about additional applications of unified intelligent information in the life sciences space, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. So we look forward to sharing this information with you and answering your questions. And with that, Lior, could you talk to us about the business problem?
Surely. And before we begin, Ann, I'm not sure if everyone could see the screen, but we're currently, I believe, on slide 5. So let us first start by providing some background with respect to the problem statement. What we're seeing is a number of clinically important conditions, such as in the area of oncology and neuroscience, have attracted a great deal of interest from biomedical research community. However, research findings have yet to be translated into significant changes in clinical practices. Specifically, drug discovery and development is a high-risk enterprise where greater than 95% of drug candidates that entered the development life cycle fail to achieve market approval. The probability of success for a new drug candidate has not significantly improved over the past 15 years. And at the same time, the public, government, and healthcare payers are challenging the pharmaceutical industry to deliver new therapeutics at reduced prices with higher safety standards. So there have been attempts to reduce the number of efficacy and safety-related failures by analyzing possible links to the properties of therapeutic candidates that have been inconclusive because of limited size of data sets from individual companies. One of the key limitations that we're seeing today in preclinical and discovery innovation is the ability to coalesce disparate data across various areas of research in order to identify new drug candidates for clinical research, as well as to discover early on opportunities to identify those early new chemical entities that might have a higher predisposition to safety or increased safety rates. So, however, what we can say is that it's not only important to identify the successful candidates, but we believe in discovery it's also important to identify those candidates that are most probable to identify for early attrition.
There appears to be an issue with the GoToMeeting, and I'm going to just take a second to try and solve that. I'm sorry to stop your
okay, no problem.
Stop your flow there.
No problem.
Okay.
No problem, man. So I'll just continue from where I left off.
Good.
And so what I was trying to outline is that in discovery, is really, in our perspective, is to improve attrition rates, whereas in clinical, the goal is to reduce attrition rates. And in that, the concept is to access the ability to improve attrition rates in discovery is limited because of access of information. And as a consequence of that, the ability to attrite new chemical entities much earlier on in the process, so that exploration of new therapeutics can be focused on areas that have the greatest area of potential. So the concept is, if you're going to fail early. So our perspective is the pharmaceutical industry remains under huge pressure to address the high attrition rates in late-stage drug development. But the question that we want to pose today is, what if we could attrite drug candidates or even new chemical entities much earlier on in the process? And we believe that this area warrants further exploration.
I did it again. And we think that one of the technical tools in the toolbox that can be used to help address this problem is something that we call unified intelligent information. Now, I spent 10 years at Gartner, and what we do at Gartner is define things. So we've actually defined unified intelligent information as a collection of richly described information assets, and those are both structured information assets and unstructured ones. They are harmonized to a consistent business vocabulary, and they can be leveraged for business value within the enterprise. Now what do we mean by that? When we say richly described information assets, what we mean is that the assets have precise, complete, and consistent metadata in the context of the problem domain. And that means not only enriching text and PDFs and lab notes and whatnot with metadata that defines what those things are about, but also enriching structured data with associations to other concepts which may not be included in the data model for the structured data that you're dealing with. When we say a consistent business vocabulary, what do we mean? We mean something that identifies the critical concepts of the business and the relationships between them. and something that recognizes the variances in language and using across the enterprise and establishes equivalence between those things. One of the things that we very often find is that people in R&D tend to refer to things by the project number. People in regulatory affairs tend to refer to things by the name of the chemical compound or the active ingredient. And very often people in marketing and manufacturing tend to refer to things by the brand name of the product. So being able to establish equivalence between those concepts and establish that essentially we're all talking about the same thing just using different words is a critical component. That's also true when you start dealing with publicly available information, scientific information that's published on the internet. To be able to establish the equivalences between those vocabularies and the vocabulary that you use internally is very, very important. And of course, it has to be leveraged for business value. If you don't have a business reason for doing this, then essentially all you're doing is making the information prettier, and there's really not much point to that. So there's a word called out on this slide, and that word is metadata. Metadata is information that describes the facets of an information asset to improve its usability throughout the life cycle. And what that means is being able to tag information assets with all of the relevant concepts that they're about and all of the relevant relationships that they contain in order to be able to marshal all of those information assets to and to use them in current research projects. There are many people that say that life sciences companies make two products. One product is pharmaceutical drugs and whatnot, and the other is information. And information is probably a larger product by volume than anything else in pharmaceutical companies. So you've got to put metadata on all of this stuff to make it usable. And there's a problem with metadata because it has to come from somewhere. We've pretty much established that there is no metadata fairy. We've pretty much established that you don't find it under cabbage leaves. And we know that creating it is very, very difficult. Some of it exists in database column definitions, but those tend to be extremely specific to the particular application that the database was built for. Some of them are rudimentary tags on documents, like when it was created and who was the author and what was the title. But the title might be something really informative like 127-4/B/52. So we need to be able to make that information externalized so that a computer can actually find the information for you that you need and make it available. And where it exists, different parts of the enterprise use different vocabularies. We've talked about that before. And probably the least productive use of anyone's time, any knowledge worker's time, is to manually apply tags to a document before they save it. Because number one, there's very, very little chance that they're going to be consistent in that application of descriptions. And number two, they all use different vocabularies, so the tags that they put are going to be extremely different. And with that, we'll talk about how unified intelligent information actually helps in supporting a healthy pipeline. Lior?
No, thank you, Ann. So now that we have that foundational understanding, we want to talk about how does unified intelligent information support improved drug discovery? What we know are life sciences organizations are information factories, but once that information is produced, it is largely underutilized, or even worse, it's not even being consumed for future use or analysis. So first, we want to be able to find the data that's most important to you. In today's standards, data mining and machine learning methods are more commonly used to properly analyze emerging high volumes of structured biomedical and biological data from several sources, inclusive of hospitals, laboratories, as well as pharmaceutical companies themselves. These data elements may include sequencing and gene expression, drug molecular structures, protein, drug interaction networks, lab monitoring data, as well as biomedical literature. Data mining methods can be used in several stages of drug discovery and development to achieve different goals. For example, most new compounds fail during the approval process in clinical trials due to lack of efficacy or adverse events. The reality is that the cost of successful, novel products often reaches millions of dollars, and the time to introduce that drug to market often spans more than a decade. What we're seeing is today, the high failure rate of drugs during this process makes the trial phases very onerous. Specifically, the ability to mine and extract relevant data assumes that the associated data elements are in a presentable, structured format in order to support that data analysis effort. One example is identifying therapeutic candidates with unacceptable toxicities. And the reason why we're focusing on unacceptable toxicities is because they account for approximately 30% of the failures in clinical studies. However, we need the ability to extract the relevant data from all sources, including unstructured information, in order to more efficiently find patterns of failures and toxicities in discovery. So predicting these interactions during the drug development phase can reduce the high costs in clinical trials and can be crucial for the commercial success of a new drug. So in essence, if we can help reduce overall toxicity or overall failure rates from 30%, let's say, to 28 or 25%, those savings can be realized in a significant way in the form of approved products in the market. Joanne?
Yes, I'm sorry, I had my, I started talking and my microphone was on mute. I apologize. Today is my day for operator error. This is actually an example of a client that we're working with now in the research and development space. They wanted to be able to leverage information from a wide range of sources, including PDFs of archived research projects that were sitting on a file share somewhere, current collaborations in their SharePoint environment, documentation from internal and external sources around clinical trials and other components. Information currently in electronic lab notebooks, and they wanted to be able to use all of that information to inform current research. They were particularly interested in being able to associate information from different and disparate silos throughout the enterprise. And one of the things that we were able to do with them was also to model the types of interests that they had and the types of documents that they had, so that when a user asks for information on a specific concept, depending on the vocabulary they use, the results that are returned to them rank the documents that are most likely to be of interest to them in the top relevance ranking. They also want to be able to extract information from various disparate projects so that they can perform sophisticated analytics to drive decision making, to discover patterns that might indicate potential toxicity of a compound that is under development at this time, or being able to identify indications of specific patient populations that should be targeted for a specific drug. So Lior, we've said all along, and I know this is going to be very strange coming from me because I work for a technology company, that this is a 50% technology and a 50% everything else problem. And the real value that HighPoint brings to this is the ability to help organizations actually think about how they're going to work differently in order to be able to maximize their capabilities. So Lior, would you talk about this a little, please?
Surely. So we may realize that technology is not the magic bullet that can solve all our challenges. There are 4 core areas to consider as you're thinking beyond technology that are inclusive of driving new insight, harmonization, embracing change, and SOP refinement. A journal article published in June of 2014 issue of Nature Reviews highlighted this key principle in terms of thinking beyond technology. The article outlined a framework based on the 5 most important determinants of pipeline success and quality, which was further described as the 5 R's, which are the right target, the right patient, the right tissue, the right safety, and the right commercial potential. A 6th factor was also described, which was the right culture, and it was discussed and defined as crucial in encouraging effective decision-making based on these determinants. However, we argue that there may be even a 7th factor, which is focused on data, specifically data that is largely inaccessible. Example of that is lab notebooks, research documents, grant proposals. Large quantities of new chemical entity information have been accumulated in the area of discovery research. Relationships and patterns within this data could provide new medical knowledge. However, accessing legacy data and existing data has largely been effective due to the established data silos as well as fragmented processes. Unfortunately, few methodologies have been developed and applied to discovery to discover this hidden knowledge. From our perspective, one of the goals to consider is not to reinvent the wheel in the area of research, but rather to use semantic tool sets and processes on less accessible data, again, lab notebooks, research documents, and grant proposals, in order to aggregate and analyze lab data to drive new insight more effectively. So how do we get there, right? And how do we start? Well, simply stated, if you look at the solution deployment lifecycle, which is inclusive of assessment, pilot, implementation, and ongoing support, we really want to start off at this assessment effort. And we realize that teams might at times want to rush right to implementing a solution and might not necessarily see the immediate value in the assessment effort. We believe that the goal of the assessment is severalfold, right? First, we want to develop a common understanding of the problem via stakeholder alignment workshops, the activities that we perform, and really that information in order to define deliverables and, more importantly, what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. Specifically, what we believe that is important to do is to map current processes and validate future objectives with key stakeholders. We also believe that using maturity analysis assessment tools to capture relevant information is going to prove to be useful, especially when you're thinking ahead in the area of piloting and implementation. Thirdly, it's looking at the data, right? Oftentimes the data is overlooked, and we believe that it's important to gather key data from the assessment in order to better understand the data landscape. For example, what percentage of your data is structured? What percentage of your data is unstructured? How easy is it to access that data? Who's governing that information? So this, if you will, process helps to enable the solution deployment process, or the solution deployment lifecycle beyond the assessment. So at the conclusion of the assessment, which typically spans 5 to 7 weeks, the organization will be better prepared to initiate pilot and implementation efforts and could potentially realize higher success rates as a consequence. So one way to look at starting the conversation is looking at stakeholder alignment workshops. And could you cover that in further detail?
This is a typical workshop that we do with businesses when we're first starting out. And what we really want to do is make sure that we're aligned to a business problem and that the business challenges are articulated and agreed to. We need to be able to identify the business impacts, and we typically do that by working through an agenda that basically talks about use cases and pain points, talks about compelling events. For example, there may be regulatory requirements that are coming into play that require you to have certain types of information within a certain time frame. And you also need to understand the business and individual objectives and the success criteria. And what we typically want to do is we want to ask who needs to be involved. Who's going to be involved in this project? Who are the subject matter experts? Who's going to provide the expertise around data governance and organization? Who's going to provide the expertise around information science? Do we have the right infrastructure? Are we technically ready to undertake this? And do we have the right skill sets? Because if we don't have the right skill sets, then what we attempt is probably not going to be successful. And what we typically come out with at the end of this process is a presentation for the sponsor and the stakeholders that has a very well-defined and bounded use case, a solution architecture or a proposed solution architecture, and probably most importantly of all, enumerated success criteria, because at the end of any effort like this, you want to be able to declare that you were successful, or declare that you were partially successful and need to make some changes, or declare that it's just not going to work for you. So one of the things we said at the beginning was that unified intelligent information is not only applicable within R&D and within the problem of optimizing the pipeline. We're actually seeing a wide range of use cases across many, many areas of the pharmaceutical business. And so, Lior, could you talk a little bit about this?
Surely. So what we're seeing today, and we realize for some of you that the use of semantic-based technology may not have been extended to your domain, but we can assure you that semantic-based technologies is really used in a variety of use cases across life sciences, such as in the area of regulatory compliance, clinical trial management, RWE in the form of real-world evidence, as well as to enhance manufacturing data. We believe that extending the use case of semantic-based capability in the area of drug discovery is a natural outcome of those mentioned experiences. Specifically, the ability to enrich data sets with supporting metadata elements, to harmonize disparate sources of information in order to create a global view of current therapeutic candidates, to extract the facts, as Anne mentioned earlier on, entities and relationships, and otherwise data that is today largely inaccessible, will aid research and discovery teams to aggregate and analyze lab data to drive new insights, thereby really facilitating improved attrition of lagging drug candidates much earlier on in the process. Again, our perspective is the goal in discovery should be to increase attrition rates, thereby helping to reduce attrition rates in later stage clinical efforts. So in summary, we have this rather universal problem in R&D. Pipelines, drugs are failing too late in the pipeline. Pipelines are very expensive. Development of new drugs is expensive. And what we are arguing is that both the business and information architectures of life sciences organizations are actually contributing to that problem. So unified intelligent information allows you to leverage information in order to make your research efforts more effective and to optimize the pipeline for early attrition, the identification of alternative indications, and hopefully the reduction of development cycle time.
But as we said before, and we can't say often enough, the technology on its own is not a silver bullet. You need to think differently about the way you work. You need to think differently about the way you collaborate. You need to think differently about the types of analysis that you do. You need to think differently about how you use information. And with that, I'm going to open us up to questions. So we've got several really good questions here. And the first one, I think, goes to Lior. What are the kinds of roles that are required for implementation, and how would I know that my business is ready?
Well, thanks, Dan. In terms of the roles that we would require initially from the assessment effort, I'll define it in two respects. One is from the services side, and then the other one is from the sponsor side. So on our end, what we typically include in such projects is a project manager / business analyst that has domain knowledge experience. Additionally, we were looking at a technical architect of sorts that is familiar with the semaphore framework and could help extend that solution design effort as part of the analysis phase and working collectively with the sponsor, in this case the business and IT leads from their respective organization to support the solution development lifecycle. On the business side, what we typically say, or on the sponsor side, is the team should be well balanced between business and IT. If you have an over leaning towards one or the other, you could get imbalances in terms of the overall solution design and approach. So we try to drive some level of equivalency. Also, we believe in the importance of having stakeholder alignment and stakeholder sponsorship. In terms of alignment, what we're really talking about is, does everyone have a consistent view of the problem? Does everybody equally share an understanding that the problem needs to be solved? And then equally ensuring that we have executive or sponsorship for the initiative, that it's not necessarily done in isolation. So what I would say is that's really how you would assess or determine are you ready, right? Number one, do you have a full appreciation of the challenge, but equally more importantly, does everyone else share in those views? Are there or is there stakeholder sponsorship or sponsorship overall for this initiative? And then lastly is, can you effectively and can the teams effectively communicate the business case and the rationale for this effort? And we realize that at times it might take some effort in order to get prepared for such an initiative, but we believe that it's very important to make sure that we have those checks in the boxes before we would start such an engagement.
Yeah, what we've seen typically from our side in efforts like these is that you have subject matter experts like bioinformaticians, clinical pathologists, researchers in various disciplines who are involved in helping to put together the model of the concepts and the relationships that drives the creation of unified intelligent information. So the subject matter experts in these cases should be drawn from a wide range of people in the research organization who have very, very different perspectives as well. Would you agree, Lior?
I would agree, and that's a great point as well, right? We want to make sure that we have a cross view, a dynamic view of the problem, right? We don't want to create silos within the organization relative to the team members that are going to be participating in these efforts, but getting a cross view is going to be critical. The other thing to say is, especially earlier on in the initiative, is not to introduce too many hands in the cookie jar. The overall teams should be limited to 10 or less, especially earlier on in the process, so we don't get mired by different perspectives or different views.
Yeah, I think that that's true, but being able to bring in the domain knowledge of additional subject matter experts who may not be part of the core project team and shouldn't be part of the core project team, but who do have critical information to make the project successful is also important. Here's a good question. What are the hallmarks that allow us to recognize when business problems might be candidates to be satisfied by semantic technologies? I have an opinion on that, but I'm sure you do too, Lior, so why don't you start?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things, right? So you have to look at your state of your information, and you have to ask yourself, how accessible is that information in my current organization? So if you're relying overly on trying to get access to data that still resides in document form or some level of unstructured type of data, and if there's an over-reliance upon that, or for example, if you have your data strewn across the enterprise in multiple share files, but it's not necessarily coalesced in one location, you could pretty much count on there is a need, right? And why it's important is, you know, discovery is really around expediency. It's around innovation. It's around driving new insight. Well, it's really hard to drive new insight when you don't have a complete purview of your data landscape. And so what we argue is that if you only have access to a partial component of your data, that's really limiting the ability to kind of, drive new science and deliver new therapeutics to the market.
I'm going to wax a little bit philosophical here for a minute, because I think that the answer to this question is actually somewhat flip, in the sense that it is any business problem that requires information. And part of it is that the information is not accessible, and part of it is that the information may not be harmonized. But one of the things that we've seen over the last 5 years or so, as everybody in the world got excited about big data, is that we had been experiencing a fairly steep value curve slope as people started exploiting relational data and started exploiting different ways of doing analytics and answering business questions. And when big data came around, everybody got really, really excited, because we thought that we were piling new data into the problem, and now the slope of the value curve was going to continue to rise. And it didn't. What it did was flatten out. And my contention is that we need to start thinking about data completely differently. We need to start thinking about it in a semantic way. We need to stop thinking about it for these purposes in terms of entities and attributes, and we need to start thinking about it in terms of concepts and relationships. The ability to take information from a structured data source and, based on the model, to relate it to information from another data source, structured or unstructured, that provides you with new insight is critical. We've pretty much exhausted the capabilities of statistical analysis. We know that the noise to signal ratio in statistical analysis is actually very high. So being able to apply new types of analytics, graph analytics, and so on, in order to discover new patterns is actually something that's opened up by being able to apply semantic technologies to these problems. Oh, here's a good one. My experience has been that organizations that try and create a single standard vocabulary and attempt to make everyone speak that language fail. what has been your experience with introducing different vocabularies and, I assume, connecting them? Well, Irina, thank you for the question. It's an excellent question. You're absolutely right. And this is one of the reasons that efforts like master data management and common, single vocabularies and common object models have had very, very limited success. What we do in a semantic model is we actually establish the equivalencies between different terms. So you may call it potato and I may call it, spud. But the fact of the matter is if my model tells me that those two things are synonyms for the same concept, then the model is able to relate them together. And then I don't have to force people to speak the same language. I can actually allow them to use all of their existing vocabularies. And it's the model that tells me when two people are using different words to express the same concept and what I need to do about it. And actually, that's something that provides additional insight, because depending on the vocabulary that's used by a particular user, I know what part of the organization that user is coming from, and I can actually present them with the information that's going to be most relevant to them. I think we have time for a couple more questions. There are two here that are actually related. And one of them is, sorry, I'm moving up and down in this thing. How is this unified intelligent information different from niche databases in this area? And the second one is, semantic techniques like natural language processing have a bad rap in life sciences because the results that are returned using statistical analysis make it difficult to determine if you're getting the right answer. How does this approach differ, or does it? So I think I'll start with that one, and Lior, you should feel free to chime in. There are many, many different niche vendors or niche databases, as the questioner terms them, that are offering work in the life sciences area. And some of them are semantically based and model driven, and some of them are utilizing machine learning. What we find is the difference in unified intelligent information, and in Semaphore in particular, is two things. Number one, the tool is model-driven and rules-based, which means that you create a model which is specific to your organization. You're not using an external model which may or may not accommodate the particular intricacies of the vernacular that you use within your organization. And you have complete editorial control over that model, which means that you can make it reflect your business domain exactly. And it's rules-based, which means that you get a high level of precision and accuracy in the enrichment, the harmonization, and the extraction, because the rules are derived from the relationships in the model, and they reflect exactly what the model says your business problem looks like. Machine learning is an interesting capability, but the amount of time that it takes to train the machine and the size of the corpus that is required is really not practical in most organizations. So this is a quicker way to value. Many of the niche vendors that are out there have capabilities that are specific to a particular therapeutic area or to a particular problem, but they don't provide you with the ability to control the environment to optimize the results that you get. Natural language processing is a supporting technology that essentially analyzes textual information to gather evidence that caused the rules to fire. But it is a second-order capability and not sufficient by itself. And we had one other question, which was actually a good one. Let me just scan down to the bottom of the list here. How would you encourage subject matter experts to be more engaged in the process of ontology development and knowledge capturing? Lior, thoughts?
Yeah, I do. So thanks, Ann. There's a couple of perspectives here. So as you're driving SME utilization within your specific org, as mentioned earlier, it's really critical to gain alignment. And specifically as you're looking at semantic capabilities, and more importantly, as you're developing your ontology within the semantic tool, in this case Semaphore, it's important to consider everyone's views. But you know, oftentimes we see teams getting mired where they're focusing on the differences versus focusing on the commonality. So kind of said earlier, right, when we're looking at controlled vocabularies and the utilization of certain controlled vocabularies within the org to support these efforts, the similar can be said as you're creating the ontology model within the semantic layer. So what we recommend is to get everybody's perspectives and everybody's understandings. In this case, as Ann mentioned earlier, creating the synonyms is a perfect example, is to get to a level of common agreement and focus on the areas from a positive perspective versus just focusing on the differences. In actuality, there will always be differences, and we pretty much see that about 10 to 20% of the differences engulf about 80% of the time. And so we just ask that the teams be mindful in terms of how they approach their decision-making process and really focus on the common views. That's why we actually recommend pilots, right, in terms of initiating these efforts post the assessment, is because the intent of the pilot is not have a fully fleshed out solution that's solving for 100% of the use case, but really identify maybe 60 to 70% of the use case going into the pilot and exploring that further before the use case is further developed in the form of requirements and functionality. So that's kind of our initial perspective, and I'm not sure if you have any additional thoughts to that.
Well, I do actually, and Muhammad, one of the most critical things that you can do to make the process of developing the model more welcoming to the subject matter experts is give them a tool that they can use. Most of the semantic modeling tools that are on the market require you to have a PhD in linguistics in order to be able to operate them. We've actually worked very, very hard to make the Semaphore ontology editor an extremely accessible tool that is simple to understand, simple to use for subject matter experts, and we've built workflows into it that allow us to engage the subject matter experts actually in the development of the model in ways that reflect how information scientists and how taxonomists and ontologists work in life sciences today. It's no longer a bunch of people that you keep in the basement behind, in an iron cage and you throw red meat through the bars periodically. Their job is not to create the vocabulary so much as to facilitate the creation of the vocabulary across the organization. And so by providing the subject matter experts with a tool that they can use with a user interface that is accessible and intuitive, and providing the information scientists with the workflows that allow them to test different suggestions against the model and to test different variants and different approaches before they commit the model, is something that actually our clients tell us is a huge differentiator for Semaphore. And so there's another question here. Have you actually implemented this in drug discovery yet, and how mature are these projects? Well, the answer to the first question is yes. We have implemented this in a variety of organizations in drug discovery and R&D. How mature are these projects? I'm not actually sure how to answer that question. Some of them have been running for some time now, but the question of whether the long-term impact on the pipeline has been achieved is probably not a question that we can answer today, and may not be able to answer for a couple of years based on the fact that it can take up to 10 years to bring a drug to market. I will tell you, however, that we're increasingly seeing people begin to identify leading indicators that they can use to identify whether they're on the right track to achieving the results that they want to achieve. And Lior, I think you have some ideas about what those might be.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at, leading indicators, as mentioned earlier on, we talked about the 5 R's, right? And in this case, what we would say is, as an example, is identifying the right tissue sample. Could be an example of a leading indicator. How easy it is for the organization to identify the right tissue sample in order to support toxicity studies, right? That could be, if you will, the question. In terms of a 24-hour challenge, what we're typically seeing from teams in discovery is that the information is not always relevant or not always available or readily available. And so looking at that in the short-term analysis could be an example of a leading indicator. On the longer-term perspective, and we realize this is definitely taking a longer-term view, is to say, what are the outcomes that we're seeing in late-stage clinical, specifically in phase 2, phase 3 efforts? Are we indeed seeing a reduced attrition rate, right? So again, the goal is to improve attrition rates in discovery, or improve the chances to attrite drug candidates in discovery, thereby reducing attrition rates in clinical or in late-stage clinical, specifically phase 2, phase 3 efforts. So if we can see a reduced rate longer term, that could also facilitate the business case.
We really don't have time for many more questions, but I did want to thank Rudy Blattman for reminding me to mention that in life sciences there are already a number of vocabularies in place, so you don't actually need to start from a blank sheet of paper when you're building your model. There's SNOMED, there's MEDRA, there's MESH, there's the ISO IDMP, which is coming shortly, God willing, and the creek don't rise. But there are numerous external vocabularies that you can and do want to link to your model so that you can have the benefit of all of that external knowledge. And Semaphore actually makes it very, very easy to do that. And with that, I think, Shanti, you're asking a question about artificial intelligence that I'm not sure I exactly understand, so if it's okay with you, I will follow up with you after this session and we can talk about it then. And she says, no worries. And so with that, I thank you for your attendance at this webinar. I hope you found it useful and informative. And we look forward to engaging with you in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.